the floor is yours, Paul. These lunchtime talks are more informal, and you've got more time to explore without interruption. But if people jump in, do share. I'm sure people have got stuff to contribute, particularly around the stuff around COVID-19. But we'd love to hear about your project too, of course.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I guess I'll introduce myself first. So my name's Paul Peacock. I've worked in mental health for the past 8 years. The majority of that time I've been a frontline mental health support worker working in youth psychiatric hostels, adult psychiatric hostels, and I work as a trainer now in mental health. I'm also a master trainer for drumbeat, and I've done a lot of work with that, especially with specialising with kids who have suffered from complex trauma, a lot of Indigenous kids and families. So kind of busy in the whole mental health scope. So Bouncing Back it's been in development for about a year. So basically the CEO of Richmond Wellbeing here in Western Australia, he was part of the Kalamunda Cricket Club, which is a cricket club up in the hills here. And about 5 years ago, their president took his own life. And what Adrian Munro, the CEO, noticed was how much of a huge impact that had on the club, but also the broader sort of group of the club, so families and players and committee members and everything. So he started to put together an idea of running programs in sporting clubs to talk about basic mental health. So last October, we received funding from the West Australian Mental Health Commission to run a pilot program, which is called Bouncing Back. And initially, during the time that it started, it was summer, so we were specifically focused on cricket clubs. But now we're open to all sorts of clubs. So we're going into football season, so we have football clubs, rugby, even as diverse as motorsport. So the moto trials, X-Trail moto trials, we're talking to them as well. Triathlons, all of that sort of thing. So it's really information that can be used in any sort of sporting area. And really the idea is that it's community. So it's just a way to focus information into the community through sporting clubs. So having listened to what everyone was talking about when I appeared, there's probably not too many stats that I'm going to be able to talk about that you haven't heard already. When we go into the clubs, it's a face-to-face talk, and we had to discuss how we were going to engage people. And I came on when you were talking about the older guys. And for me, the older guys are almost the key, especially in sporting clubs that have been around for a long time. You know, we may disrespectfully call them, you know, the barflies, the people who don't play anymore, but they still want to be part of the community and sitting at the bar. A lot of the time, it's really important to connect with those guys because they still have a huge influence on the younger guys. So a lot of the negative behaviours that we see, especially within football clubs, it's just a learnt behaviour by watching the older guys, what they're doing. So if we can change the way the whole club culture works, and we can get these key older guys doing the right thing and talking the right way around mental health, drugs and alcohol, then that's a great way to lead the younger guys into those behaviours. So it has to change. It doesn't change from the bottom up. I think it changes from the top down. So first thing, when we go into clubs, it's very non-threatening. We rock up. The first thing I say to all the guys is, I'm not going to ask you questions. I'm not going to make people make any disclosures. And at the end of the night, we're not going to dance around in a circle and sing Kumbaya. That's not what it's about. It's about us having a conversation with the guys and just talking about mental health and how they can address mental health issues and how they can look after their mates. And then what we actually do at the end of the session is we do a meat raffle. So we have evaluations that we want people to fill out, and we found that if we get the guys involved in a meat raffle, we get 100% uptake on the evaluations, and that's how we get all the information that we need to find out what's going on. And I'll talk about that a little bit further. Excuse me, a little bit further down the track. So the first thing we talk about in the presentation is the statistic that suicide is the biggest killer of men aged 18 to 40, that 6 Australian men a day on average are taking their own lives. Now we're going to rewind a little bit, because 3 months ago is when we stopped doing face-to-face, when COVID-19 started to hit. And we know that those statistics now are starting to change. And we probably won't know the truth about the impact of COVID-19 on mental health and suicide rates for months, if not years. So the Australian Medical Association, one of the predictors they have at the moment is that the suicide rates could double or even triple over the next year to 5 years. So we're looking at an increase of 750 to even 1,500 people taking their own lives, men taking their own lives in the next few years. And what's really important to understand about that is that when I tell sporting clubs that, they're really surprised, because they you know, a lot of young guys think, oh, it's car accidents, it's cancer, it's this, it's that, and they don't understand that it's suicide that is the most likely cause of death for men in that age bracket. And then what we talk about is the fact that for a death to be classified as a suicide, there has to be overwhelming evidence to prove that it's a suicide. And it can take up to 18 months for it to be deemed a suicide. So a lot of people, you know, if you're talking about, you know, overdoses or crashing cars or all of those sort of things, when we know that it's most likely to be suicide, it's actually deemed death by misadventure. So the statistics of men taking their own lives, is actually way higher than what we have on paper. And that's just something that we want to talk about in our sporting clubs. The other thing that we talk about is that 50% of the population are going to experience some sort of mental health issue in their lives. It's you know, half of us are going to experience that, and whether that's depression, anxiety, or something else, it's common. It's not something that shouldn't be spoken about. We need to talk about it because it's a really, really common thing. And we talk about that in a way that we want to reduce the stigma of mental health. I'll get to that in a second. And then we go into the basics. So we talk about what promotes good mental health, and we know that being part of a sporting club is one of those things. Being part of community, the acts, belong, commit sort of message is that to have good mental health, some people need to be part of the community and part of groups. We talk about how it's important to be physically active, and that's what your sporting club does for you. Having fun. I heard you guys talking about humour. It's so important. You've got to be able to have a laugh. You know, it's a way that we vent. We feel good when we laugh. Eating well. And then we talk about drugs and alcohol. And there's other programs that sort of talk about alcohol use and drug use. My background working in psychiatric hostels is I've worked at the pointiest end of drug addiction and drug abuse. I've witnessed people overdosing. I've been assaulted. I've had to manage a lot of critical incidents around drugs and alcohol. And we talk to the guys about the fact that the drugs that are out there nowadays, they're unpredictable. So using meth is a really unpredictable drug, and the effects are terrible. And we talk about trying to get guys to talk to each other about, you know, the dangers around synthetic drugs. So, you know, your bath salts, chronic, all of those sort of things that back in the older blokes' days, I'm 50, so back in the day when it was just marijuana and stuff like that, that was really it was nothing compared to what the young guys are on now and what people are using now. But the thing is that it's become socially acceptable in a lot of our clubs for people to be using meth. You know, back in the 80s, if somebody was using heroin, it was shocking. That's terrible. Meth is worse, but it's become this socially acceptable thing. And I've actually had clubs. I had a club contact me before we sort of went into the COVID-19 lockdown, and their team had won the grand final, and they went on a meth bender. And it was 5 or 6 guys out of the team. So they wanted me to actually sit and talk to these guys. And, you know, I work with 25-year-olds who can't walk properly anymore, who can't talk properly anymore, who'll never work, who'll probably never be able to afford a home or get a license. And that's through drug abuse. So we just talk about the realities of drug abuse. And we talk about the ideas, the things that can have a negative impact on our mental health. And a lot of what we're talking about nowadays is the gig economy, is people who aren't secure in their jobs because they might just have a contract until December for a year or whatever, that there's stresses over jobs. There could be everyday stresses within families, whether it's through divorce or a loss of a loved one or any of those things that build up those stresses in people's lives. It could be new jobs, it could be moving a home. Any of those sort of things can be a precursor to a mental health issue, but sometimes people suffer from mental health issues for apparently no reason whatsoever. So I talk about my own experiences. I've suffered from anxiety and depression for my entire adult life. And I've had a pretty good life. I had a good childhood. Everything was good for me, but it's something that I live with and I experience. I know that some of my work has added to that. I know there's been vicarious traumas through my work that has added to my anxiety and my depression. But basically, for me, it sort of came out of nowhere. And the other thing that we tell them is that 85% of people who do experience a mental illness are going to experience that before the age of 25. And that also correlates when a lot of young guys are starting to experiment with drugs and alcohol. So when you're talking schizophrenia or hearing voices, kind of different things, there's arguments whether it's drug induced or whether it's genetic, or so when some people are hearing voices, it's also around the sort of same time that they're experimenting with drugs and alcohol. But it is the age, especially for men, when then they might start to experience those issues. So we talk to them about the fact that most people who experience mental illnesses or mental challenges, 80% of those people are actually going to make a full recovery. Yep. And for the people who do experience it, a lot of those people will actually come out stronger for having experienced it. So, I talk to people who've suffered from depression and those sort of things, and they are incredibly strong people because they're still living and they're still moving through the world, even though they experience really traumatic things and really, really challenging experiences. And the two keys to mental health that we talk about with these guys is, if you have a mental health issue, it doesn't mean that you're broken. Yeah, it's not a permanent thing, and it's not a weakness. I was running a pilot program through Drumbeat for military veterans, and we were talking to these guys, and they were talking about that if they were injured, that the military would actually deem them broken. And for a lot of them, that was, a real trigger for depression and anxiety, because to be told if you're broken, that you couldn't be fixed and you were worthless, and you were no longer of value to the military. So we noticed for a lot of the guys within the military, that was something that really negatively impacted them. And so the same with mental health is that if guys feel that they can't talk about their mental health or talk to their mates in a team about what's going on for them, then they start to feel like they're broken, and they can't be helped. And that's when things start to go wrong. And for guys, they think it's weak. There's a weakness to it. A lot of people say to me, and I'll talk about my experiences as I go, but a lot of people talk to me, and when I talk about my experience with depression and anxiety, they say, "Oh, you're so brave. You're so brave to talk about that." And for me, that's actually wrong. You shouldn't be brave to talk about it. You should just be able to talk about it. It should be something that as men, as humans, men and women, that we can actually do that without having to feel that we're being incredibly brave to talk about that. So the main things that we talk about with the players is anxiety and depression, and we try to explain what that is and how that affects us. So my sort of explanation for anxiety for me is the bear in the woods analogy, and that's it. We get them to imagine that you're walking through the forest, and it's a beautiful day, and you're very calm, and everything's great, and the birds are singing in the trees. And out of nowhere, this massive grizzly bear flies out of the bushes and rears up in front of you, with teeth gleaming and huge claws. And you go into that fight or flight mode, and you're panicking, and your heart is racing. Your endorphins are going crazy, and there's that terrified sort of hit. Well, for a lot of people, anxiety and panic is all of that, but there is no bear. So those emotions can be triggered. For me, as far as anxiety is concerned, I could wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and my heart is just beating, and it's not because something's happened. It's just that's what's happening. So, we know a lot of people who end up in hospital thinking they're having heart attacks, they're having a panic attack or an anxiety attack. So we talk about that. We try to normalize that. We try to help them to identify when you're feeling stressed, or whether it's an issue that you need to go and talk to somebody about. Depression is the other one that we need to talk to these guys about. We know it's becoming more prevalent. We know, obviously, that's one of the things that can lead towards people taking their own lives. And depression can be very difficult for people to really identify what those feelings are and how that affects them. So I talk of my depression. It took me a long time to work it out, because I would sort of go into black dog mode, and I'd be very, very low, and I'd be, I wouldn't know why. And it took me a long time to work out that when I feel depressed, I actually feel nothing. So I'm not actually sad. I'm not angry. I'm not anything like that. I actually, there is a feeling of nothing. So most people wouldn't know when that's happening. So I'm laughing with my kids, I'm playing with my kids, but on the inside, there's not a lot going on. But it took a long time for me to understand what that is, and then to sort of get help for that. And the more I started to talk about that with my mates, all of a sudden people are putting their hands up and going, "Yep, me too. Yep." And people start to understand that it's really common for people to have those feelings. And we want people to be able to talk to each other about that. So the key to bouncing back is that we want people to be able to change the culture of a club. That if somebody's feeling low, or if somebody identifies that somebody looks like they're not traveling too well, or they're not turning up to training, or they're getting agitated, or they're just not being themselves, is that we want clubs and team members to be able to learn how to approach that person and say, "How's things? You okay? What's going on, mate?" And we want the other ways. We want them to be able to go up to their teammates or their captains or their coaches and just say, I'm not doing too well. And people need to be able to talk about it, because the days of get over it, toughen up, princess, that's over. Because if our response to somebody who says, "I'm not feeling great," is get over it, you'll be right, toughen up, princess, that might be the one time that person actually puts their hands up and say, "I need help." And that's when we lose people. So getting back to the fact is, a lot of the older guys in the clubs who are really influential and people look up to, and he's been around the club for 30 years, if the feedback they get from them is get over it, that's going to be a really, really tough thing. So we want to change the way that people respond to mental health, and we want to make sure that this whole idea of people checking up on mates is actually becomes club culture. Because stuff like "Are you okay" day is fine, but what about when somebody says no? We need to have the skills to actually address that. So if somebody says no, I'm not doing well, we want to be able to address that. So the bouncing back program is that what we do at the end of that is that we want them to use the services. We want them to use Lifeline. We want them to use Beyond Blue. We want them to use all of these array of services for them to contact. And what we did notice was I was training another trainer to do the bouncing back trainings. So I've worked in mental health for a long time. I've told countless people to call Beyond Blue or Lifeline or anything like that. And I'd never done it myself. I'd never spoken to them myself. So I had no idea. So we had a conference call with Beyond Blue and Lifeline. And I said, look, I'm going to be telling guys to contact you if they're feeling low or they need support. What do you do? And the guy from Beyond Blue said I was the first person who's ever done that. So it's been interesting just to I can tell the guys that I work with that I've done it, I've spoken to them, this is what you can expect. This is how they're going to respond to you. They're not going to ask ridiculous questions. They're not going to send the police screaming around to your house. They're not going to tick a box and say that you're crazy or anything like that. They're going to give you proper support and they're going to give you advice on how to get through what you're getting through. And then the last thing that we do is that we created the Club Champion program. And the Club Champion program is Richmond Wellbeing actually offers professional training to anyone in the club who wants to identify as a club champion, somebody who can champion mental health within that club. So they can actually come to us and we'll train them in trauma-informed practices, recovery-based practices. We'll put them through the Assist 3-day suicide prevention program. And we're also looking at young umpires and coaches, and we're looking at allowing them to come and do our professional development in de-escalation and crisis intervention, because we know a lot of umpires cop a lot of abuse, and there's a lot of situations that they're placed in that they can learn those sort of skills in de-escalation as well. So that's pretty much it. The only other thing is that the evaluations that we do, we have a questionnaire and we have a K10 at the end of that. So we use the K10 diagnostic at the end of that. And what we have identified in a lot of clubs is that there's a lot more guys seriously struggling than the clubs are aware of. So it allows us to actually come back and say, hey, look, out of the 15 guys who attended, you had 6 guys who are in high risk category in a K10. And here's how you can support them. And here's how we can sort of guide them in the right direction. And the clubs have found that really helpful. When we launched in October, within a month of us launching, there was 4 clubs in Western Australia that had 5 suicides. So coming out of COVID-19, it's going to take a while for us to actually get the proper numbers of what's going on, but we'll find out in the next few weeks. We're relaunching Bouncing Back as Bouncing Back Navigating the New Normal, and we're sending out surveys to clubs to find out, what's impacting men's mental health now. Have people lost their jobs? Can they afford to come back to sport? Can they afford to send their kids back to sport? Is there shame connected with that? Are they scared to come back out? And the sort of issues whether drug and alcohol use has increased over that time as well. So we're relaunching that in the next week. So it's going to be very interesting to see the feedback that we get and the connection we get back with our sporting clubs from there. So there you go. Any questions?
Great. Thanks, Paul. Really appreciate you taking time to come and provide a lunchtime talk to us both on your specific program, which sounds fantastic, and to make sure the sport of cricket is represented here, and it's not just soccer and footy and NRL, but also to open up a bit of a deeper conversation about the context we're currently facing, which is obviously doesn't need repeating, but I'm going to repeat it anyway. Is COVID-19. So look, we've got the floor here for as long as people want. The actual next session starts at 2 p.m. So I'm going to hand over to Greg Milan, president of the Australian Men's Health Forum, just to facilitate the conversation. Two things looking for here. In the first instance, any responses to either Paul's talk and his project, but also an opportunity to share your own experiences of how you're adapting to COVID-19. It doesn't matter if it's a sports-based program, if you're from a men's shed or a suicide prevention organization or a men's group, whatever. Really interesting because we're all in it together, apparently. And so whatever one of us is doing is probably relevant to anyone else. And then more broadly, as we move towards 2 o'clock, there's just a general opportunity to make sure you say hello and get connected, because this is part of the networking part of the day. But are you okay to stick around a little bit, Paul? For
yeah.
Great. So
Absolutely.
Greg, I'll hand over to you, Greg. But
Great.
I'm interested to let anyone in the room contribute to this part of the conversation.
Yes, thanks, Glenn. That's really great. Maybe as a starting point, were there any questions or comments you want to make to Paul after his presentation?
Hey, Paul.
Yes, Ross.
Yeah, I suppose I just wanted to say, like, obviously with us all working in the men's health space, you're right. It's such a strange thing, and like I work predominantly with Aboriginal men, and I think like we are bad enough at having those conversations, but I feel like especially in the communities and stuff, the men are just not interested in having those conversations at all in general. But having worked through organizations like the Men's Shed here, if you do get them in that space where it is, maybe just 5 or 6 blokes who don't have anyone else looking, there's no one in the community is going to see them talking. You get one of them talking and you're right. And then all of a sudden, the things that they'll open up and share with you is unbelievable. But I find it really interesting, that difference from when you see them out and about, they might give you a quick hello and that's it. And you think, they're really shy and, that they're not going to talk to you, but you get them in a small group and you engage them and you have a laugh and you joke around, and that just gives them that space to talk and open up. And it's a brilliant way to do it. And I think if more people understood exactly what you said around that, these conversations would be able to flow and happen so much more freely. And, men in general would just be better at talking about things that are going on. Because I think you're right. There are so many people that will be, having things like anxiety and depression, but will just put on a brave face every day. And because they think, they're not brave enough. But you're right. It shouldn't be a matter of being brave enough. It should just be, I'm having a shitty time. Here's what it is.
Yeah, look, you bang on. What we do is at the end of each session, I always say, I'm going to be here for half an hour. Okay. I've never walked away from a session without 2 or 3 blokes coming up and going, yeah, and having those conversations. And it's also great because my boss tells me I've got to have a beer as well. So I get told to have a beer at work. That's fantastic. But it's people, they're scared to say it until somebody else steps up and says it. And that's men, we can be pretty dumb. It's a tough thing to do. But that's what our program is, that we want people to talk about it. We want to normalize it, and a lot of guys can do that, and it's what the interesting thing that we're finding as well is that we're having to change that culture, especially with more women who are involved in sporting clubs. It's cricket and football now. A lot of the culture has to change anyway, and that's gonna challenge. I'll just say quickly as well, when we talk about the we're all in this together thing, I would just temper that with as human beings, we may be all in this together, but over the past 3 months, my all in this together is very, very different. I'm been happily married for 28 years. I've got 2 kids. I haven't lost my job. I've got a house and a dog, and my wife is still working, and it's been really stable. So my all in it together has been pretty cool. Other all in it together is fathers who've never had to deal with their kids for 24 hours a day for 3 months, stressing out, losing it, the more use of alcohol and drugs, relationship breakdowns, people who live in abusive relationships. Their all in it together is very, very different to my all in it together to somebody else's all in it together. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge the fact that the past 3 months have been very, very different for a lot of people.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I just picked up a comment from Deborah out of the chat box there about I think she said, how do we talk to older men who still have this suck it up sort of view on life? Deborah, did you want to talk a bit more about that?
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Paul. Great session. You mentioned that when the younger guys went and spoke to the older guys about how they were feeling, and please tell me if I got you wrong, the older guys would just sort of tell them to suck it up and stop being a princess or something like that. How do you change? Is that right? Is that what you said?
Well, it's kind of a common trope. If somebody's feeling low or sad, get over it, you'll be fine. And I think like with a lot of things now, especially like gender, sexuality, all of those things, it's time that we call people on their bullshit. And there's a way of I had one guy, I went to one club where they literally had somebody take their life the week before, and we had a really good conversation about it. And then one of the sort of stalwarts of the club sort of pulled me over there, and he goes, "Oh yeah, but he's an arsehole for killing himself, isn't he?" And I challenged him on that, and we had a conversation with it, but nobody's challenged him on those sort of his thoughts and his emotions before. So I think it's with the idea of the club champions is that we actually give them the do's and don'ts, things to say, things to not say, things to challenge. So if they hear somebody saying that, if the response now is no, we don't talk like that anymore. If everybody's telling that, then people who do talk like that, they're going to slow down on it, because the response from everybody else is no, that's not what we do anymore. But it's something that's going to change over years. But if the clubs start to implement that and say, this is what's acceptable, this isn't what's acceptable, then that's when we slowly start to make those changes.
Thanks, Paul. So it's not just the older men who are saying to these younger guys, suck it up. It's sort of, it's not age or anything like that related.
No, it's everything is experience related. If your dad's telling you to suck it up, then you're going to tell somebody else to suck it up. It's experience. It's the experience that people have. Some of the young guys have exactly the same attitudes, but you only develop attitudes through experiences.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, good point.
Trying to change it within that space and say, for the clubs themselves to say, this is what's acceptable and this isn't what's acceptable anymore.
My opinion is that I think it is generational. I started running weekends for men with depression and anxiety back in the late 1880s, early 1990s. Take a group of men away for a weekend to talk about their clinical depression or anxiety. At that time, there was so much more stigma around. You didn't have anyone on television, sportsman, politician or otherwise, who was out there saying, I've got depression. That happened a long time after, 10 years after. So that, getting men to come away for a weekend was hard because they felt this enormous stigma and that. But we had great weekends. It ran for quite a few years. It was funded quite generously by a drug company. And I think it ran for about 8 years. And then I've continued that program on in a different format called Beating the Blues. So I do a lot of group work with men with depression. And I think it is kind of generational because our young men today in their 20s, 30s, 40s are talking about how they feel, are more open. We've had a long period of good men's health work in this country, which has help support all of that stuff. I think we still do have, and I'm recognising a group, you know, I don't want to put an age on them, but they're much older men who are a bit, as Deborah's trying to say, stuck in their ways. And, you know, and that's still problematic. But I like the idea when I hear you say that you've teamed up young men with older men and had tried to get them to have a conversation about that. That's excellent, because I work now with a lot of older men, and they've changed too. Some of them are a bit old-fashioned, but they have changed too about how they feel about things and how they talk about mental health issues. Is there anyone else in the room who wants to have a quick come in and who hasn't spoken today maybe and talk about if you work with men with mental health issues or any comment about depression and anxiety? I'm just skirting a very small room at the moment. It's been good, and it's also what I like about your work. Obviously, it's with cricketers and not just with footballers and that. But we've seen a lot of development over the time of football and cricket, role models, virtually role models, the ex-premier of Western Australia and Jeff Kennett, all of them saying, look, I've had, you know, and politicians saying, I've had mental health issues. And that's a good thing to do, because that's taking the stigma away from the whole issue. And one of the projects that I've been talking about over the last few days in Men's Health Connected, of course, is Mr. Perfect, which has started in Sydney, but is all over the place at the moment. There's a couple of 2 or 3 groups, I think, run in Western Australia, where you just get men together for a free barbecue and something to eat and a chance for them to talk about their mental well-being. Something as simple as that works. I run the one in Newcastle here where I live, and it absolutely works, just giving people a space where they can bring up anything that they want to talk about. Sorry, was that a comment? Yeah, I like when we ran the first one last September in Newcastle, we had a couple of guys, mid-20s maybe, 20, 25, 26, mid that range. I think they'd been through the system and they sort of came along and were checking us out. And one of them said, oh, you're going to have guest speakers? I said, no. Oh, well, you're going to want us to talk? No, I don't want to do anything. And he said, oh, that's really good. I like this. Yeah, the fact that we're not doing anything, we're not, you know, we're not running a group, we're not expecting them to do anything apart from to be there and have something to eat, enjoy the day. And then they did just start, later on in their own time, they just start talking about things and chatting with other guys. And it's a really great formula. I look it up, MrPerfect.org. They're a really great group. And what I've seen happen over the time is we've got so many more people working in this area, working in the mental health area and working with men in specific ways. We're into week 2 now of Men's Health Connected, and so many projects that we've seen. It's amazing the amount of work we've got going on there, and we need more of it. But I think we've changed from the bad old days, I think, in the early 90s when depression and anxiety was still taboo subjects for a lot of people. Is there any other... I don't want to hog the limelight here, by the way. I'm trying to encourage people to have a few words on what's going on. Neil is still around? No. Okay. People might be taking a bit of a lunch break. Did you want to... I think you've expanded pretty well, Paul, on what you do and how you do it. Have you ever entertained the idea of a longer session, like a weekend away for men, or something that's a bit longer?
Yeah, look, we're trying to work out. I think when we started the program, we realised that because it's a pilot program, we've tried to create it also as we go. What works for guys and what doesn't work for guys.
Yeah.
So there's actually 4 parts of the program. So we have the initial sort of go out and do the 30-minute chat. And then we've got the club champion support program, which is the personal training.
Yep.
And then we've got one for youth, so we can talk about youth mental health.
Yep. Yep.
And then the last one that we go back for, and the clubs can choose whether they want to get involved or not, is basically getting them all around the table and basically writing a new sort of a new pathway or new rules for the clubs. Obviously, the issues that we face as well is, the socio-economic stuff is different. So, you're going to have the high socio-economic areas seem to be, there's less self-harm, suicidal, that sort of stuff. Socio-economic areas, you have those issues. You have issues with clusters. So a lot of the time in football clubs, it won't, over here we had, I think, a rugby club on the coast, and they had about 5 young men in 1 year take their lives. So you sort of have clusters of that. Try to be able to be as reactive as possible. The WACA, the West Australian Cricket Association, jumped on board with this straight away. Cricket Australia promoted this straight away. But we don't know what's going to happen at the end of the year. We don't know whether we'll get refunded at the end of the year. Because obviously with this whole COVID-19 thing, everything is completely up in the air for a lot of programs. So, yeah, look, there's a lot that we want to do. Our plan is that once the COVID-19 thing is sorted, is that we would get all of the club champions from all the clubs once every 2 or 3 months, actually at head office here at Richmond, and do a sundowner where they tell us what's going on and what they're experiencing and what they need to improve as it goes.
Yeah. I guess we don't actually know what it's going to be like. We've got no idea what it's going to be like once we come out of the social isolation and all the, all the restrictions on us. It'll be a different world for a lot of people, I think. Will be the idea of working from home might become more of a reality than working in an office. There'll be some structural changes like that, but there'll also be a huge amount of people who've been unemployed and have to find jobs again. So, we've got a lot of things, and we're all sitting here, I think, anticipating that these things will be, there'll be more depression, there may be more suicide, there may be more problems for people. The other side of that is there may be also some positive things that have happened that I think we need to keep our eye on for people. And some of these changes have been good for some people. We're finding that out too. Yeah, but it's a really mixed bag. We don't know until we get there. But the government is helping us, at least with AMHF, and we're aware. We've already done a few activities, including this, including Men's Health Connected, to give people a space to talk about it in, and also for us to gather more information about what's going to happen. Have there been, apart from the two things I said about working at home, is there anybody else, how's the coronavirus affected them, just briefly? They want to say anything about that in any other ways?
If no one else wants to chat.
No.
I've heard two really positive things that came from the coronavirus, and obviously these are privileged, as Paul was saying before. Everyone experiences this differently. But one of the really positive things I've heard is that a new father was able to stay at home and watch, be really present with his new baby. And I think she took her first steps or something while he was home. And normally he'd be out working, but because he was forced to work from home, he was right there witnessing all of that sort of stuff. So he was absolutely, thrilled that he was there. And then an older man was telling me that he wasn't sure about how he was going to retire and all of this sort of stuff. And he said that having to stay at home gave him sort of a little insight into retirement, and he thought he should really get his shit together because it's very different from what he thought would be happening. And so it's given him a real insight into, well, if I'm going to be home all the time, what am I going to do with myself?
I think that's really important. That's really interesting that he's had a tester of retirement. That's great, because a lot of men, leave their job at a certain point, say at 65, and go home and don't know what to do. That they start thinking about their retirement 2 years before they have to retire in the first place. So that's really interesting what you said, working with older men, that it's given them a test run so that when he goes back to his workplace, he'll have some knowledge of what it's like, and he'll be able to think out and plan how he's going to cope when he's really retired. I think that's happened to a lot of men.
Right.
Thanks. Okay, home back to Glenn.
Thanks so much. And for me to chip in, my one thing, I live in this little town of a couple of thousand people, which normally sort of expands to up to about 5,000 people because it's a tourist town. So we've had no tourists, no grey nomads, but no backpackers, and just people who live in the town. And it's been like living in a sort of like slightly idyllic sort of a Mediterranean village where you can't walk down to the beach, which is usually only 5 minutes away, without giving yourself an hour to walk down to the beach, because you bump into so many people. And because we've got this sort of shared experience of going through lockdown together, we've got this way of people you used to nodding acquaintances have become friends and people whose name you know. So that the social connection part has bizarrely, at this time of social isolation, massively increased for us. And I just feel incredibly blessed because I've got family and old parents in the UK, for example, who are having a completely different experience of this pandemic. So Paul, thanks for joining us. I'm really glad we got you in, just to hear about the program was as a bonus. But then to have that broader conversation and exploration around the current context of COVID-19 was excellent. Stick around if you can. I'm sure you're a busy person. This next session is going to focus and look at the question, how can we leverage sports brands more? It's coming up in 3 or 4 minutes. And right now I'm just going to do a quick look around the room and check in with our speakers. But before I do, thanks to Greg Milan for facilitating the conversation there. Thanks to everyone who stayed around, Paul Peacock from the Bouncing Back Project. And I posted it, you mentioned Drumbeat there a couple of times, Paul. I've posted a link to what I think is the Drumbeat Project, but if I got it wrong, do post it again. Because you're obviously a great advocate for that program, so I chucked it in the chat box.
Thank you. It's the Hollyoak Drumbeat. Yeah.
I got the right one then.
That's the one. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Great, thanks, Paul.